The air is thick with the sweet, heavy scent of wine, undiluted Thasian, dark and expensive. It mingles with the smoke of oil lamps and the sharp, clean aroma of bay leaves scattered across the mosaic floor. From a corner, the gentle, melancholic plucking of a seven-stringed lyre weaves through the conversation, a sound designed to soothe, to elevate, to civilize. The voices are a low, confident murmur. Men reclining on cushioned couches, their fine linen tunics draped just so, are engaged in the most sophisticated of human endeavors, the pursuit of knowledge. They speak of virtue, of whether it can be taught, or if it is a gift from the gods innate in the souls of the best men. They dissect the nature of the ideal state, a republic of reason and justice. The name of Socrates is invoked, his theories on the soul debated with the casual intimacy of men who believe themselves to be his intellectual heirs. This is the Greek Symposium, the beating heart of Athenian culture, a place where civilization is not just celebrated, but actively forged in the crucible of discourse. Our focus, however, is not on the men who speak. It is on the silent figure who moves between them, a ghost in his own life. He is perhaps 17, though it is hard to tell. There is a youthfulness in the lean lines of his body, yet his eyes hold the ancient, weary stillness of a weathered stone. He holds a bronze huenocho, a wine jug, its surface cool against his trembling fingers. His movements are a study in practiced invisibility. He refills a guest's kylix, the shallow, two-handled wine cup, without a sound, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid so as not to violate the first rule. Never meet the gaze of a free man. As he straightens up, the man on the couch, a renowned rhetorician whose speeches on civic duty are memorized by students, reaches out. His hand, soft and plump with a life of leisure, lands on the boy's arm. It is not a violent gesture. It is casual, possessive, the way a man might stroke a prized dog. The fingers tighten slightly, a silent command. The boy freezes. The rhetorician does not even pause his sentence. He is arguing a fine point about the concept of eudaimonia, human flourishing, while his touch communicates a different, far more primal truth. You are property. You are here for my pleasure. Your flourishing is of no concern. The lyre plays on, the debate continues. The boy stands, a living statue, the wine jug growing heavy in his hand. In that moment, the entire world shrinks to the pressure of those 5 fingers on his skin. He can feel the heat of the man's palm, the slight dampness of it. He can smell the wine on his breath. Across the room, another boy, younger, perhaps 14, is feeding olives to a politician. For a fleeting second, their eyes meet over the reclining forms of their masters. There are no words. There is no need for them. In that shared glance, a library of suffering is exchanged. It is a look that says, I see you. I know. Survive this night. This is the story of the silence that underpins the noise of history. It is the story of the beautiful marble columns that rest on foundations of human bone. We remember the names of the philosophers, the playwrights, the statesmen. We have forgotten the names of the boys who poured their wine. This is the story of one of them, a boy who was taught the true meaning of philosophy not through lectures, but through pain, in a world that celebrated the beauty of the human mind while systematically destroying the human soul. Before the symposiums, before the wine and the predatory hands, there was the house. And to understand how a human spirit can be methodically dismantled, you must first understand the architecture of the cage. The boy, let us call him Lycon, a common slave name, meaning wolf cub. An ironic tribute to a wildness that would soon be tamed, first saw the oikos of his new master, Lysander, through a haze of fear and exhaustion. From the outside, it presented a deceptively simple face to the dusty Athenian street. High, windowless walls of sun-dried mud brick, a single imposing wooden door. It was a fortress designed to protect the family and property within. Lycon was now part of that property. He was led through that door into a different world. The noise and stench of the city fell away, replaced by an ordered, unnatural quiet. He found himself in a peristyle courtyard, open to the sky. In the center, a small fountain trickled into a marble basin, the sound echoing in the sudden stillness. Slender columns supported a covered walkway. and the walls were adorned with vibrant frescoes depicting scenes from the Trojan War. Achilles, glorious and godlike, dragged the body of Hector behind his chariot. Lycon stared at the image, at the hero's triumph and the victim's degradation, and felt a cold knot of recognition tighten in his stomach. He was beginning to understand which role he was expected to play. This was the public face of the household, a space designed to impress guests and display Lysander's wealth and culture. But the house had a second, hidden geography. His guide was a man named Demetrius, the household overseer. Demetrius was not like the slave traders, brutish, loud, their cruelty simple and direct. He was something far more dangerous. He was a man of middling years, with the hard, muscular body of a laborer, but the intelligent, calculating eyes of a merchant. He had been a slave himself, captured in a war against Thrace decades ago. Through a combination of cunning, loyalty, and a complete willingness to inflict upon others what had once been inflicted upon him, he had risen. He was a testament to the system's most insidious promise, that the most compliant slave might one day hold the whip himself. He was living proof that the path to comfort was paved with the suffering of your brothers. Demetrius led Lycon away from the sunlit courtyard, through a series of corridors, past storerooms and kitchens where other slaves worked with silent, frantic energy. The further they went, the darker and narrower the passages became. The elegant frescoes gave way to bare, damp stone. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of sweat, stale bread, and human despair. They descended a short flight of stone steps into the basement, the true engine room of the Oikos. This was the space that made the beauty above possible. Here were the small windowless cells, barely large enough for a man to lie down, where the male household slaves were kept. "This is your place," Demetrius said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He pointed to a cell containing a straw pallet, a ragged blanket, and a clay chamber pot. "The rules are simple. You eat what you are given. You sleep when you are told. You speak only when a free person speaks to you first. You do not look them in the eye. You do not show emotion. Sadness is an annoyance, and happiness is an insult. Your purpose is to be invisible until you are needed, and completely obedient when you are." He paused, studying Lycon's face, searching for flickers of defiance. "My master, Lysander, is a man of refined tastes. He appreciates beauty and order. He despises clumsiness and disobedience. If you please him, your life will be tolerable. You may even receive better food or a warmer blanket. If you displease him..." Demetrius let the sentence hang in the air. He didn't need to finish it. The scars on the arms of a nearby slave told the rest of the story. This was the first lesson in Lycon's new education, the destruction of self. His own name, the one his mother had whispered to him, was forbidden. He was Lycon now. His rough country tunic was taken, replaced by a simple thin chiton that felt alien against his skin. He was taught how to walk differently, how to pour wine without spilling a drop, how to stand silently for hours, merging with the shadows of a room. Demetrius was a master of this psychological alchemy. He rarely used the whip in these early days. Pain was a crude tool. It was more effective to use uncertainty, to create a world where the only path to safety lay in anticipating the master's every whim. Demetrius would ask him impossible questions, then punish him for not knowing the answer. He would give him contradictory orders, then punish him for his confusion. It was a methodical process of eroding his confidence, his identity, his very ability to think for himself, until all that was left was a vessel waiting to be filled with the will of another. He met the other slaves in stolen moments, in the shared misery of their basement world. There was Marcus, a boy his own age from Anatolia, his spirit already dimmed after 2 years in the house, who taught him how to read the subtle shifts in Demetrius's mood. There was old Alexios, captured in Sicily, who bore the deep, crisscrossing scars of a failed escape attempt on his back. He warned Lycon in a harsh whisper about the symposiums, about the special entertainments the master's guests expected. And there was 14-year-old Philemon, the son of a bankrupted merchant, whose soft hands and educated speech were a constant, tragic reminder that he had not been born for this life. It was Philemon who explained that Lysander's Oikos was not just a home, it was a business. The master was a connoisseur, collecting beautiful boys the way other men collected fine pottery, and his symposiums were a showroom for his collection. Lycon learned that the house itself was a diagram of power. Lysander, the absolute monarch, resided in the sunlit rooms above. Demetrius was his trusted viceroy enforcing his rule, and they, the slaves, were the foundation, buried in the dark, holding up a structure of beauty and elegance they were never allowed to enjoy. The trick, the one that kept the entire system from collapsing, was teaching the foundation to hate itself, to see the boot on its neck and be grateful it wasn't a sword. Demetrius was the master architect of this self-loathing. He would reward a slave with a piece of fruit for reporting another's minor infraction, fostering a climate of suspicion that made solidarity almost impossible. He created a cruel hierarchy, where a slave's only chance at improving his own miserable lot was to contribute to the misery of another. Lycon, the wolf cub, was learning to live in a cage where the bars were not made of iron, but of fear, shame, and the slow, chilling death of hope. The house was beautiful, but it was a tomb, and he was beginning to understand he had been brought here to be buried alive. The Symposium was the grand theatre where the philosophy of the house was put into practice. The andron, the men's dining room, was prepared with ritualistic care. Slaves like Lycon would spend the afternoon cleaning the mosaics, polishing the bronze lampstands and arranging the 7 cushioned couches, the clean-eye in a U-shape around the room. The air would be filled with the scent of crushed flowers and incense, a fragrant mask for the moral decay to come. As the guests arrived at dusk, they were the very picture of Athenian nobility. There was Dionysios, the politician, a man whose powerful orations on the supremacy of Athenian law could move the entire assembly to action. There was Cleomenes, the shipping magnate, who had recently donated a significant sum to rebuild a temple, an act of public piety that earned him widespread praise. And there was the most honored guest, Sophistes, a philosopher whose treatises on the nature of the good life were celebrated for their intellectual rigor and moral clarity. These were not thugs or barbarians. They were the architects of a golden age, men who believed deeply in their own intellectual and cultural superiority. The evening would begin with decorum. Libations were poured to the gods. The first few cups of wine were mixed with a generous amount of water, as was the custom for civilized men. The conversation was elevated, touching upon the latest plays of Euripides or the strategic situation in the ongoing war with Sparta. Lycon and the other boys moved silently along the edges of the room, serving roasted meats, cheeses, and honey cakes. In these early hours, they were almost invisible, their humanity completely erased, functioning as little more than animate pieces of furniture. But as the night wore on, and the water-to-wine ratio in the crater grew steadily smaller, the atmosphere began to shift. The intellectual veneer started to crack. The philosophical debates gave way to boasting, the poetry recitations to bawdy songs. The men's gazes began to linger on the serving boys. This was the transition. This was the moment the masks of civility were set aside, and the true purpose of the evening was revealed. It was Sophistes, the philosopher, who selected Lycon that first night. He beckoned him over with a crooked finger. "Boy," he said, his voice slick with wine, "come, sit. Let us test the Socratic method. Tell me, what is the nature of beauty?" Lycon froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew this was a trap, a game. He mumbled that he did not know, my lord. "Of course you don't," Sophistes chuckled, the other guests smiling in amusement. "True beauty, as Plato teaches us, is a form, an ideal that can only be apprehended by the intellect. But the body, this clumsy vessel of flesh, can be a pale reflection of that form, a first step on the ladder of enlightenment." His hand landed on Lycon's knee. "Oh, your body, for instance, has a certain pleasing geometry, a rustic, uneducated kind of beauty." The philosopher began to use his hands to illustrate his philosophical points, his touch tracing the lines of Lycon's body as if he were a statue. He spoke of the distinction between the active and passive roles in nature, the dominant and the submissive. It was a lecture, a philosophical argument that served as a grotesque preamble to assault. And Lycon realized the most terrifying truth of all. In this man's mind there was no contradiction. The philosophy was not a cover for the cruelty, it was its justification. He looked to his master Lysander for help, But his owner was smiling, pleased with the performance. This was, after all, the point. The boys were not just for physical use. They were props in the intellectual games of their masters. To use a slave was one thing. To do so while simultaneously delivering a sophisticated monologue on the nature of existence was the ultimate display of civilized power. Another guest, the politician Dionysius, chimed in. "Be careful, Sophistes. Aristotle warns us that some are slaves by nature. Their souls lack the rational principle to govern themselves. You cannot teach philosophy to a plough horse." "Ah, but that is the very point," Sophistes countered, his grip tightening on Lycon's arm. "We are not teaching him. We are using him for his natural purpose. His body serves our minds. His submission allows our intellects to soar. It is a harmonious hierarchical order. In fulfilling our desires, he is fulfilling his telos, his ultimate purpose. It is, in a way, an act of justice." The other men laughed and applauded this perverse intellectual flourish. They had done it. They had taken an act of brutal, violent exploitation and, with a few philosophical phrases, transformed it into a noble, even virtuous act. They were not rapists. They were teachers. They were not tormentors. They were instruments of the natural order. This moral alchemy was their greatest, most terrible invention. It allowed them to commit unspeakable acts while preserving their sense of absolute moral superiority. What happened next was a blur of humiliation and pain, set to the soundtrack of learned laughter and philosophical debate. Lycon's struggles were met with clinical interest, his cries of pain analyzed as if they were the uncivilized expressions of a creature that could not appreciate the intellectual feast being offered. He was held down, his tunic torn away, and he learned that the most profound cruelty is not inflicted by monsters who know they are monsters, but by men who believe they are gods. Afterward, cast aside and left to crawl back to the darkness of his cell, Lycon lay on the straw pallet, his body a map of another man's pleasure, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the searing clarity in his mind. He finally understood. These men, the greatest minds of the ancient world, were not hypocrites. A hypocrite knows the good and does the evil. These men had redefined evil as their personal good. They had built an entire intellectual universe around their own appetites. They had hollowed out the meanings of justice, virtue, and beauty, and wore them like empty masks. The boys in the room were not an exception to their philosophy. They were the silent, screaming proof of it. Lying in the dark, Lycon knew he hadn't just been assaulted by a man. He had been violated by an entire civilization. How does a boy become a thing? The transformation does not begin in the candlelit terror of the andron. It begins much earlier, under the harsh, unforgiving sun, in a world far from the philosophical pretensions of Athens. It begins with the cold mathematics of survival. In a small forgotten village, nestled in the rocky hills of Arcadia, life was a precarious balance. Lycon's family did not measure their wealth in silver, but in the yield of their barley field, the health of their 3 goats, and the number of olive jars in their storeroom. His childhood was not idyllic, but it was his. It was the smell of his mother grinding wheat, the rough bark of an olive tree under his climbing hands, the sound of his father's voice telling stories of ancient heroes by the fire. It was a life defined by connection to his family, to his village, to the spirits of the land. Then came the blight, a season of too little rain, followed by a season of too much. The barley withered, the olives rotted on the branch. The goats, their only source of milk and cheese, grew sick. Debt, a concept Lycon had never understood, became a hungry ghost haunting their small mud-brick home. The creditor was a wealthy landowner from a nearby town, a man whose fortunes were built on the misfortunes of others. He did not want promises. He wanted payment. The slave merchants arrived in the village like vultures drawn to a dying animal. They were not monstrous figures with whips and chains, not at first. They were businessmen. They spoke of opportunity, of contracts, of a chance for a young, strong boy to earn a good wage in the city, to send money home, to learn a valuable trade. It was a lie, but it was a lie wrapped in the seductive language of hope. Lycon remembered the day of the transaction with a clarity that time could not dull. He remembered his father, a proud man broken by helplessness, refusing to meet his eyes. He remembered his mother turning away, her shoulders shaking with sobs she tried to stifle. He was 12 years old. He was told to stand straight, to show his teeth, to make a muscle. The merchant, a man named Skillax, examined him with the detached professionalism of a butcher inspecting livestock. He ran a hand through Lykon's hair, felt the strength of his back and nodded. This one has good bone, he'll fetch a fine price in the city, too pretty for the fields. The jingle of silver coins being counted into his father's palm was the sound of his childhood ending. 30 pieces of silver, a coin for every tooth in his head, perhaps. His father's hand trembled as he took the money, the price of his son's life. They told him it was for 20 years of service. They told him he would return a man. They told him to be brave. The lies were a final, bitter kindness. The journey was the beginning of his unmaking. He was no longer a son, a villager. He was now part of a slave coffle, a human caravan of despair. A dozen boys chained together at the neck, stumbling down dusty roads that led further and further from everything they had ever known. The iron collar rubbed his skin raw. The sun beat down. The overseers were liberal with their staffs, correcting any boy who stumbled or cried too loudly. He learned the rhythm of the march, the scrape of feet on rock, the jangle of chains, the stifled sobs of the boy in front of him. They were marched through Boeotia, a landscape of rolling hills and fertile plains. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. But Lykon saw none of it. His world had shrunk to the few feet of chain that bound him to his fate. At night, they were staked to the ground like animals. They slept in the dirt, huddled together for a warmth that was more than physical. They were cargo, being transported to market. The Athenian agora was an assault on the senses. The roar of 1,000 voices, the smell of unwashed bodies, dung and fear. And then he saw it, the Kuklos, a circular stone platform where the human merchandise was displayed. Men, women and children stripped naked for the inspection of buyers. He saw people from all over the known world, dark-skinned Nubians, pale Thracians with fierce, terrified eyes, slender Ionians. Slavery was the great, brutal melting pot of the Greek world. Before his sale, Lykon was washed and oiled. It was not an act of kindness, it was about presentation. The oil made his young muscles gleam in the Attic sun, making him appear healthier, more appealing. He was placed on the platform. The auctioneer, one of the state-appointed politai, began to chant his attributes. A fine Arcadian boy, 12 years of age, strong, healthy teeth, a gentle temperament suitable for household service. The code words were clear. He was being sold for a specific purpose. Hands prodded him. Men forced his mouth open, ran their fingers over his limbs. He was an object, a piece of pottery being checked for cracks. The bidding was brisk. He heard the numbers climb. Each bid a pronouncement of his worthlessness as a human and his value as a commodity. The winning bidder was Lysander. When the transaction was finalized, the auctioneer performed the ritual. He gave Lykon a light slap on the cheek, a symbolic gesture to show he was no longer his own person. He now belonged to another. The silver coins that had bought him likely came from the mines at Lorient, dug from the earth by other slaves, in a perfect closed circle of human misery. From the earth to the mint, to his father's hand, to Lysander's purse, a river of silver fed by a sea of tears. That was the economy of this glorious civilization, and he was now its currency. Survival in the house of Lysander was an education in the art of erasure. The perfect slave, Lykon quickly learned, was a vacuum, a presence that displaced no air, cast no shadow, and made no sound. He mastered the art of psychological absence, of retreating to a small, protected fortress deep within his own mind, while his body performed the tasks required of it. During the long nights of the symposiums, he would float somewhere above himself, an out-of-body spectator to his own humiliation. He learned to observe, to catalogue, to remember, but not to feel. Feeling was a luxury the dead could not afford. But even in this environment of totalizing oppression, the human spirit is not so easily extinguished. It seeks out cracks in the stone, tiny fissures of light in the suffocating darkness. Resistance was not found in grand, futile gestures. Alexios's failed escape was a cautionary tale whispered among the slaves. The scars on his back were a permanent text on the price of open defiance. No, resistance was a quieter, more subtle language. It was what the historian James C. Scott would centuries later call the weapons of the weak. It was the grammar of silence. It was in the way a slave might feign a moment of clumsiness, letting an expensive imported wine cup slip through his fingers and shatter on the mosaic floor. The act would earn a beating, but it was a small tax paid for a moment of satisfaction, a tiny disruption of the master's perfect order. It was in the deliberate misunderstanding of a complex order, a feigned ignorance that would slow down the work of the household and cost the master time and energy. It was a war of pinpricks, of petty sabotage, invisible to the masters who saw their slaves as simple-minded beasts, but a source of shared, secret pride among the oppressed. Language itself became a battlefield. Demetrius forbade the slaves from speaking their native tongues. To speak in the accents of Arcadia or Thrace or Phrygia was to remind their masters that they came from somewhere, that they had a past, a culture, a family. It was to assert an identity separate from their role as property. And so in the dead of night, huddled in their wretched cells, they would whisper. They would teach each other words from their homelands, a Greek word for bread, a Thracian word for freedom, a Lydian word for mother. It was a quiet act of intellectual rebellion, a refusal to let their very minds be colonized. The most powerful form of resistance, however, was storytelling. The house had its own secret oral history, a counter-narrative to the heroic frescoes on Lysander's walls. When a new boy arrived, the older slaves would teach him not just the rules of the house, but the stories of it. They would tell him about the boy who had died from a fever 2 winters ago, preserving his real name, the name his parents had given him, not the slave name Lysander had assigned. They would recount the acts of cruelty inflicted by specific guests, turning them from random acts of violence into a documented history of injustice. They memorialized the dead and bore witness to the crimes of the living. This act of remembering was a profound defiance against a system designed to erase them, to render them anonymous and interchangeable. By remembering a fallen comrade's name, they were insisting he was a man, not an object. Lycon found his place in this secret society. He became a keeper of stories. He listened to Alexios's tales of the sun-drenched hills of Sicily. He learned from Marcus the Anatolian folk songs his grandmother had sung to him, and he, in turn, would whisper stories of the Arcadian mountains, of the smell of pine after a rain, of the taste of wild goat cheese. These stories were more than nostalgia. They were anchors. They were proof that another world had existed before this one, and therefore another world might exist after. They were a collective assertion of a past, and by extension a future, that Lysander and his world sought to deny. This secret culture had its own risks. Betrayal was a constant threat. The poison Demetrius dripped into their community. The promise of a better meal or a less strenuous task could tempt a desperate soul to report on his fellows. But more often than not, the bonds held. They were forged in the heat of shared trauma. They learned to communicate with a silent language of glances, a slight nod that warned of Demetrius's approach, a quick touch on the arm that offered comfort after a brutal night. They would share stolen scraps of food, take turns keeping watch while another slept, and clean each other's wounds. These small acts of solidarity, of mutual care, were in their own way as revolutionary as an open rebellion. In a world designed to atomize them and turn them against each other, every act of kindness was a victory. It was a quiet declaration that they were not the animals their masters believed them to be. They were a community. They were human. And they would not let that humanity be entirely consumed by the beautiful, hungry house. The body is a ledger. It keeps an honest account of every blow, every violation, every sleepless night. After more than a decade in the house of Lysander, Lycon's ledger was full. He was perhaps 25, an old man in the brutal economy of the Symposium. The lean grace of his youth had thickened into a scarred, weary resilience. The fire in his eyes had long been banked, leaving behind the grey ash of exhaustion. His usefulness as an object of novel beauty had depreciated to nothing. The guests, always hungry for fresh youth, now looked through him. He had become part of the furniture in a different way, old, familiar, and invisible. The summons came on a cool autumn morning. Demetrius called him to his small functional office. the administrative hub of the household's machinery of suffering. There was no pretense of emotion. It was a business transaction. "Lysander has sold your contract," the overseer stated, not looking up from his wax tablet. "Your services are no longer required here. You're being assigned to the Lorien mines." Lorien. The word fell into the silence of the room with the finality of a spadeful of dirt on a coffin. The silver mines. It was not a reassignment, it was a death sentence. Every slave in Athens knew of Lorien. It was the source of the city's wealth, the silver that paid for its fleets, its temples, its democracy. And it was a charnel house, a place where slaves were sent for the final, most brutal extraction of their value before their bodies were discarded. The life expectancy of a miner was measured in months, not years. The work was crushing, the conditions lethal. It was the final destination. Lycon received the news with the placid emptiness he had perfected over years. He felt no shock, no fear, not even sadness. It was simply the logical conclusion of his story. He had been bought with silver from Lorien, and now he was being sent back to the source, closing the circle. He was a coin, spent and worn, being returned to the mint to be melted down. His last night in the house was surreal. He lay on the same straw pallet in the same cell that had been his world for 13 years. The sounds of the house were the same, the distant laughter of the master, the hurried footsteps of other slaves, the ever-present trickle of the courtyard fountain. But for him it was all fading, becoming the province of ghosts. In the deepest hour of the night, a figure appeared in his doorway. It was Marcus. His old friend had survived differently. By being exceptionally pliant and intelligent, he had been promoted to the role of personal attendant to Lysander's wife, a position that offered a degree of safety from the horrors of the Andron. He said nothing. In the dim light from the corridor, he pressed something small, cold and hard into Lycon's hand. Lycon looked down. It was a piece of sharpened bronze, perhaps a broken stylus, its point honed to a wicked sharpness. It was a tool. It was a key. It could open a lock. It could open a vein. Marcus met his eyes, and in that look, Lycon saw the culmination of their long, silent friendship. It was not a suggestion. It was a gift. The gift of a choice, a final act of agency in a life that had been defined by its absence. Alone in the dark, Lycon held the weapon, the first he had held since he was a boy. He weighed his options. Escape. A fantasy. He would be hunted down by the Scythian archers who served as Athens' police force and be made an example of. Revenge. He could lunge at Demetrius in the morning, or perhaps even Lysander. It would be a single, satisfying flash of defiance before he was cut down, or suicide. He could rob them of their final profit. He could choose the moment and manner of his own end, a last desperate assertion of control. But as the first hints of dawn began to grey the edges of the dark, a different kind of clarity came to him. All those choices were about him. They were about his pain, his revenge, his dignity. But the resistance he had learned in this house, the grammar of silence, had never been about the self. It had always been about the other. It was about the community of the damned. His story was ending, but there were other boys who would lie in this cell. There was Philoman. There were others whose names he did not yet know. Before the guards came for him, Lycon crept to the cell of a newer, terrified boy from Thrace. He slipped the bronze shard under the boy's pallet. He passed the story on. He bequeathed the choice. He could not give the boy hope, but he could give him a possibility, a final sentence in his own story that he could write for himself. It was the only legacy he had to give. The journey to Lorien took him south, through the familiar landscapes of Attica. But now he saw them with new eyes. He was a dead man on furlough, granted one last look at the world of the living. He saw the Parthenon gleaming on its high perch, a monument to a civilization built on his back. He smelled the salt of the Saronic Gulf. He watched an eagle soar on the thermals and remembered, for the first time in years, what it felt like to dream. The mining camp was a vision of hell, a sprawling, chaotic city of smoke, noise, and misery. The earth was scarred and pitted, the air thick with acrid smoke from smelting furnaces and the fine silicate dust that was a death sentence for the lungs. The slaves were gaunt, hollow-eyed figures, their bodies caked in dirt and sweat, their movements slow and labored. This was the engine room of Athens, and it ran on human fuel. He was sent down into the earth, into tunnels so narrow he had to crawl on his hands and knees. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering light of a single oil lamp. The air was hot and suffocating. The sound of hammer against rock a constant, deafening rhythm. This was Tartarus. The silver veins in the rock gleamed like the eyes of malevolent gods. This was it, the end of the world, and in that suffocating darkness, he prepared to die. In the crushing blackness of the Laurian mines, Lycon discovered a final, unexpected truth. Even here, in the deepest circle of hell, the grammar of silence persisted. The slaves, drawn from every corner of the known world, had created a society. In the brief moments of rest, in the shared darkness, they whispered, they shared what little food and water they had, they held the dying. And they told stories. They spoke of their homes, their families, their gods. They created a vast, multilingual oral history of their suffering and their survival. Lycon's story, the story of the Arcadian boy sold for 30 pieces of silver, who survived the perfumed horrors of a philosopher's symposium, became a part of that history. He was no longer just Lycon. He was a voice in a chorus, a thread in a tapestry of remembrance. His name was spoken, his life was witnessed. His death, when it came a few months later in a minor tunnel collapse, was not the end. It was an absorption. His story was carried forward by the men who buried his broken body, passed on to new arrivals, whispered in the darkness as a lesson, a warning, and a memorial. The story echoes still, because the symposium never truly ended. It simply changed its decor. The fundamental architecture of that room, a space of comfort, pleasure, and intellectual pride for the few, built upon the silent, invisible suffering of the many, is a blueprint that civilization has never discarded. We tell ourselves we are better now, that we have evolved beyond such barbarism. But the systems of exploitation have not vanished. They have merely become more sophisticated, more abstract, more distant. We still have our symposiums. They are the boardrooms where profits are calculated based on the exploitation of unseen workers in faraway lands. They are the digital spaces where algorithms designed for our engagement and pleasure feed on the anxieties and insecurities of the vulnerable. They are the halls of power where eloquent speeches about justice and human rights are delivered by those who benefit from systems that deny both to millions. The ancient philosophers used convoluted arguments to justify the ownership of human bodies. Today, we use complex economic theories and dense legal frameworks to achieve the same result, the conversion of human lives into a commodity. The moral blindness that allowed Lysander and his guests to debate the nature of virtue while torturing a child is the same moral blindness that allows us to enjoy the fruits of a global economy without acknowledging the human cost. We have simply outsourced the cruelty, hiding it behind supply chains and corporate veils. The boy in the mine died so that Athenian citizens could have the leisure time to invent democracy and philosophy. Today, children disappear into systems of trafficking and abuse, their suffering fueling industries that cater to the appetites of the powerful. The faces change, the excuses evolve, but the fundamental transaction remains the same. The leisure of the privileged is still subsidized by the misery of the powerless. Perhaps the greatest horror is not that these things happened in the ancient past, but that we have learned so little. We still build our marble temples and congratulate ourselves on our enlightenment, while the foundations groan with the weight of unseen suffering. The boy's story is a whisper from the past, a chilling reminder that cruelty, dressed in the robes of sophistication, is the most dangerous cruelty of all. His voice is a ghost that haunts our own gilded age, asking a simple, terrible question: who is pouring your wine? The echo of his life is all around us, in the silence of those we render invisible, in the beautiful surfaces that conceal ugly truths, in the low, constant hum of a machine that runs on forgotten souls. The symposium continues, and the wine cup is never empty.